Blood froze on Lieutenant James Mitchell's skin as he hung from the wooden cross in the desolate wilderness, his hope fading with each labored breath in the merciless cold. When two massive white horses emerged from the swirling snow, their intelligent eyes fixed on his bound form, he had no way of knowing these wild creatures would not only save his life, but heal the broken pieces of his soul that war had shattered. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The wind howled across the vast, snow-covered desert, carrying whispers of a story that would soon become legend in Redemption Valley. Lieutenant James Mitchell had been missing for 3 days now. The search parties had combed through the rugged terrain, but hope was dwindling with each passing hour. The bitter cold of winter had settled over the land, turning the once golden landscape into a merciless white expanse that showed no mercy to the lost or abandoned. James had returned from his third tour in Afghanistan 6 months ago, his body intact, but his soul fractured by the horrors of war. The nightmares that haunted his sleep, the memories that refused to fade, and the guilt that weighed on his conscience had all but consumed him. His wife, Emma, had watched helplessly as the man she loved disappeared into the shadows of his own mind. "He just walked out," Emma told Sheriff Donovan, her voice breaking as she clutched their 5-year-old daughter's hand. "He said he needed some air, but he never came back." Sheriff Donovan nodded, his weathered face revealing nothing of the concern that gripped his heart. He had seen too many veterans return from war, only to fight an even harder battle at home. James had been one of the strongest men he knew, but even the strongest have breaking points. "We'll find him, Emma," he promised, though he wasn't sure if he believed his own words anymore. What none of them knew was that James had ventured far beyond the town limits, driven by demons only he could see. His mind, clouded by PTSD and despair, had led him into the sacred lands where the wild horses of Redemption Valley roamed free. These weren't ordinary horses. They were descendants of the original Mustangs that had survived against all odds in this harsh environment for generations. Massive, powerful creatures with an untamed spirit that commanded respect from all who encountered them. The locals spoke of these horses with reverence, claiming they possessed an intelligence beyond that of normal animals. Some even believed they were guardians of the land, protectors of those who respected the delicate balance of nature. But James knew none of this as he wandered aimlessly through the snow, his military training the only thing keeping him alive in the freezing temperatures. On the third night, as the temperature plummeted to dangerous levels, James collapsed near an abandoned ranch. His strength finally gave out, his body surrendering to exhaustion and cold. It was there that Hank Reeves found him, barely conscious and mumbling incoherently about the men he couldn't save. Hank Reeves was a man with his own troubled past. Once a respected rancher, he had lost everything to gambling and alcohol. His resentment toward those more fortunate had festered over the years, turning into a hatred that consumed him. When he recognized James as the decorated war hero the town had welcomed home with such fanfare, something dark stirred within him. Well, look what we have here," Hank muttered, his breath visible in the frigid air. "The mighty Lieutenant Mitchell, not so mighty now, are you?" James, delirious from exposure, could barely focus on the figure standing over him. "Help, please," he managed to whisper through cracked lips. But help was the last thing on Hank's mind. In his twisted thinking, James represented everything he had lost: respect, honor, purpose. With surprising strength for a man his age, Hank dragged James to the remains of the old barn. There, in a grotesque display of cruelty, he bound James to a wooden crossbeam that had once supported the roof. "Let's see how brave you are now, hero," Hank sneered as he finished securing James to the makeshift cross. "Maybe your government will come save you. Or maybe those medals will keep you warm." With a final malicious laugh, Hank disappeared into the night, leaving James to what he assumed would be a slow, painful death. The hours passed torturously as James drifted in and out of consciousness. The cold had numbed his extremities and his mind wandered through fragments of memories. Emma's smile on their wedding day, the sound of his daughter's laughter, the faces of the men in his unit who had trusted him with their lives. He had failed them, and now he had failed his family too. As dawn broke on the fourth day, James opened his eyes to a surreal sight. Through the haze of pain and cold, he saw two enormous white horses standing before him, their breath creating clouds in the frigid air. They were unlike any horses he had seen before, massive and powerful, with intelligent eyes that seemed to look right through him. James blinked, certain he was hallucinating, but the horses remained, watching him with an intensity that seemed almost human. They were the famous white Mustangs of Redemption Valley, though James didn't know it. What he did know was that their presence stirred something within him, a flicker of hope where there had been only despair. The larger of the two horses approached cautiously, its hooves making almost no sound in the fresh snow. It stopped just inches from James, its warm breath thawing the ice that had formed on his eyebrows. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, man and beast connected by something beyond understanding. Then, with deliberate gentleness, the horse began to nudge at the ropes binding James to the wooden beam. The second horse joined in, using its teeth to pull at the knots with surprising dexterity. James could hardly believe what he was witnessing. These wild creatures, these magnificent beasts, were trying to free him. This can't be real, James thought, as he felt the ropes loosening. I must be dying, and this is some kind of hallucination. But the pain as circulation returned to his limbs was very real, as was the thud of his body hitting the snow when the ropes finally gave way. James collapsed, too weak to stand, his limbs refusing to obey the commands of his frozen mind. The horses stood over him, their massive bodies blocking the wind, providing a shield against the relentless cold. In that moment, something broke inside James, not in the destructive way that war had broken him, but in a healing way, like the breaking of a fever. Tears froze on his cheeks as he reached up with a trembling hand to touch the muzzle of the horse nearest to him. The connection was electric, a current of life flowing between them. "Thank you," James whispered, the words inadequate for the emotions swelling in his chest. The horses remained with him as feeling painfully returned to his limbs. They stayed close, their body heat helping to ward off the deadly cold that had nearly claimed him. When James finally managed to sit up, leaning against the wooden beam that had been his cross to bear, the horses settled in the snow beside him, patient guardians in a harsh wilderness. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, James found himself talking to these silent companions, sharing burdens he had never voiced to another living soul. Not to his therapist, not to Emma, not even to himself in his most honest moments. He spoke of the guilt, the fear, the overwhelming sense of responsibility for lives lost under his command. And the horses listened, their eyes never leaving his face, their presence a balm to his fractured spirit. What James didn't know was that these horses were about to lead him on a journey that would not only save his life, but transform it in ways he could never have imagined. The path to redemption sometimes appears in the most unexpected forms, and for James Mitchell, it had come in the shape of two wild horses on a snowy morning in the middle of nowhere. As the morning wore on, James's strength gradually returned, though the pain in his frozen limbs was almost unbearable. The horses remained by his side, their massive bodies creating a windbreak against the relentless cold. When he finally attempted to stand, his legs buckled beneath him, sending him face first into the snow. The larger of the two horses, a magnificent stallion with intelligent eyes, lowered its head and nudged James's shoulder, as if encouraging him to try again. With trembling arms, James gripped the wooden beam and pulled himself upright, leaning heavily against it for support. "I need to get back to town," he murmured, more to himself than to his equine companions. The horses watched him intently, their ears pricked forward as if they understood every word. The smaller one, a mare with a distinctive gray patch on her forehead, stepped closer, positioning herself alongside him. James stared at her, suddenly understanding. With painstaking effort, he reached out and grasped her mane, using it to steady himself. The mare remained perfectly still, allowing him to lean against her powerful frame. The stallion moved to his other side, creating a support system that allowed James to take his first tentative steps away from the abandoned barn. Miles away in Redemption Valley, Sheriff Donovan was briefing the largest search party the town had ever assembled. Emma Mitchell stood at the back of the room, her face pale with worry, but her eyes burning with determination. "We've covered the north and east quadrants," Donovan was saying, pointing to a map spread across the table. "Today we'll focus on the western ridge and the old mining roads. James is a trained soldier. He knows how to survive, but in these temperatures..." He left the sentence unfinished, the implication hanging heavy in the air. A young deputy raised his hand. "Sheriff, what about the wild horse territory? It's a massive area, and none of our search parties have gone that far." Donovan shook his head. "It's too dangerous. Those horses are unpredictable and the terrain is treacherous. Besides, why would James go that far out?" Emma stepped forward then, her voice quiet but firm. "Because that's where his grandfather used to take him as a boy. He told me stories about those horses. He said they were the most beautiful creatures he'd ever seen." The sheriff's expression softened. "Emma, that's a protected wilderness area. It's hundreds of square miles of rough country." "Then we better get started," she replied, her resolve unshakable. Back in the wilderness, James was making slow but steady progress with the help of his unlikely companions. Every step was agony, but with the horses flanking him, he managed to keep moving. The mare seemed to sense when he needed to rest, stopping periodically to allow him to catch his breath before continuing on. As they traveled, James noticed something extraordinary. The horses were not simply wandering aimlessly, they were leading him in a specific direction. The stallion would forge ahead, clearing a path through the deeper snow, while the mare stayed beside James, matching her pace to his laborious shuffle. "Where are you taking me?" James wondered aloud. The mare nickered softly, as if responding to his question. By midday, they had reached a sheltered canyon where the snow was shallower and the wind less fierce. James's military training kicked in as he recognized the tactical advantage of the location, protected from the elements and with good visibility of the surrounding area. It was the kind of place he would have chosen for a temporary base during operations. The horses led him to a small overhang in the canyon wall where the ground was relatively dry. Exhausted beyond measure, James collapsed onto the hard earth, his body trembling with cold and exertion. The stallion disappeared briefly, returning with something in its mouth, a clump of dried grasses that had dropped at James's feet. James stared in disbelief. "Are you bringing me food?" The gesture seemed impossible, yet there it was. The mare had meanwhile settled beside him, her body radiating warmth that James gratefully absorbed. He examined the dried grasses and recognized them as a type of wild wheat. It wasn't much, but it was something. As he chewed the tough stalks, extracting what little nutrition they offered, James found himself talking to the horses again. "My grandfather used to tell me stories about horses like you," he said between bites. "I thought they were just tall tales to entertain a kid." He paused, studying their intelligent faces. He said the Mustangs in these parts were different, that they chose who to trust. The stallion snorted, pawing at the ground as if impatient. James couldn't help but smile, his first genuine smile in months. "Yeah, I know. Sounds crazy. But then again, so does being rescued by two giant horses." As the day progressed, James's condition improved marginally. The food and rest had helped, but he was still dangerously cold and dehydrated. The mare suddenly rose and moved toward the back of the overhang. James watched as she pawed at the ground persistently, eventually revealing a small seep of water emerging from the canyon wall. "Well, I'll be damned," James muttered, crawling over to the tiny spring. The water was ice-cold and fresh, and he drank greedily, feeling life flowing back into his body with each swallow. That night, as temperatures plummeted again, the horses lay on either side of him, their massive bodies forming a living cocoon of warmth. In the darkness, with only the sound of their breathing for company, James found himself confronting the demons that had driven him into the wilderness in the first place. "I led 20 men into an ambush," he whispered into the darkness. "I was responsible for them, and I failed. 8 didn't make it home." The words hung in the frigid air, the first time he had spoken them aloud. "Everyone calls me a hero, but heroes don't get their men killed." The mare shifted closer, her head coming to rest near his shoulder. There was something comforting in her presence, a non-judgmental acceptance that allowed James to continue unburdening himself. "When I came home, I couldn't reconnect. Everything felt wrong. Emma tried so hard, and my little girl." His voice broke. "I couldn't even hug my own daughter without seeing the faces of those dead children in that village." The stallion raised its head, regarding James with what seemed like understanding in its deep brown eyes. There was something almost human in that gaze, a depth of empathy that penetrated the walls James had built around his heart. "I didn't come out here to die," he admitted, the truth of it surprising even himself. "I came out here because I couldn't bear to live like that anymore. I needed something, an answer, a reason." He laughed bitterly. "Instead, I got tied to a cross and rescued by wild horses. If that's not the universe having a sick sense of humor, I don't know what is." As he spoke, snow began to fall again outside their shelter, the world becoming a swirling white void. James watched the hypnotic dance of snowflakes, feeling oddly at peace despite his dire situation. Something was changing inside him, a shift so subtle he could barely perceive it, yet profound in its implications. For the first time since returning from Afghanistan, he found himself wanting to live, not just exist, but truly live. And somehow, inexplicably, these wild creatures seemed to be showing him the way. Dawn broke over Redemption Valley, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of pink and gold. James awoke to find the stallion already standing, alert and watchful at the entrance to their shelter. The mare remained beside him, her warmth having kept him alive through the frigid night. Outside, the snowfall had ceased, leaving behind a pristine blanket of white that stretched as far as the eye could see. "We need to get moving," James said, his military instincts kicking in. He knew that survival in these conditions meant constant movement. Despite the pain that still racked his body, he forced himself to stand, using the canyon wall for support. The mare rose gracefully, shaking off the light dusting of snow that had settled on her white coat. She positioned herself beside James once again, offering her strength as he took his first tentative steps of the day. The stallion led the way, plowing through the deeper drifts, creating a path that James could navigate with the mare's assistance. As they emerged from the canyon into the open wilderness, James was struck by the raw beauty surrounding him. The mountains rose majestically in the distance, their peaks catching the morning light. In another life, he might have appreciated the view, but now his focus remained singular: survival. "Emma must be out of her mind with worry," he murmured, guilt adding to the weight on his shoulders. The thought of his wife and daughter gave him renewed determination. He had to make it back, not just for himself, but for them. They deserved better than the shell of a man he had become. The horses seemed to sense his resolve, matching their pace to his growing strength. Every so often, the stallion would stop and look back, as if checking that James was still following. The mare stayed by his side, her presence a constant comfort in this harsh environment. By midday, they had covered several miles, following what appeared to be a natural path through the wilderness. James noticed signs that this route was well traveled by the herd. Flattened areas where snow had been cleared by multiple hooves, branches broken at heights that suggested horses had pushed through. "You're taking me to your herd, aren't you?" James asked the mare, who flicked her ears in response. The idea should have frightened him. A man alone among wild horses was hardly safe. But instead, he felt a strange sense of anticipation. Meanwhile, the search party had ventured deeper into the wilderness than ever before. Sheriff Donovan led one group west toward the old mining roads, while Emma insisted on joining a second group headed toward the protected wild horse territory. Her guide was Tom Blackfeather, an elderly native man who knew these lands better than anyone. "My grandfather told me stories about these horses," Tom said as they followed a narrow ridge overlooking a vast valley. "He said they choose who to help and who to harm. They can sense a person's heart." Emma might have dismissed such talk as superstition before, but desperation had opened her mind to possibilities she would never have considered. "Do you think they might have found James?" Tom's weathered face remained impassive. "If they did, either he's very lucky or very worthy." The group pressed on, fighting against time and the elements, each member silently acknowledging the diminishing odds of finding James alive. But Emma refused to give up hope. Something told her James was still out there, still fighting. Back in the wilderness, James and his equine companions had reached a sheltered valley nestled between two towering cliffs. Here the snow was shallower and patches of hardy grass peeked through the white blanket. As they descended into the valley, James heard the unmistakable sounds of horses. Whinnies and snorts carried on the wind. When they rounded a bend in the path, James stopped in his tracks, awestruck by the sight before him. A herd of at least 30 wild horses grazed in the valley, their coats ranging from pure white to dappled gray. They were all massive like his companions, with powerful builds that spoke of generations surviving in this harsh environment. At their approach, several horses raised their heads, regarding the newcomers with interest. The stallion moved forward, greeting what appeared to be the lead mare of the herd with a gentle touch of noses. James hung back, suddenly aware of his vulnerability. "Easy now," he whispered to himself as much as to the horses watching him. "I'm not a threat." The mare that had accompanied him nudged him forward, seemingly encouraging him to approach the herd. With cautious steps, James allowed himself to be guided into their midst. To his amazement, the horses made no move to flee or attack. Instead, they regarded him with the same intelligent curiosity he had observed in his two companions. The herd had created a microclimate in the valley, their bodies generating enough heat to melt the snow in patches and expose the grass beneath. James watched as several foals played together, their antics a stark contrast to the grim struggle for survival that had defined his last few days. For the first time in longer than he could remember, James laughed, a genuine, heartfelt sound that surprised even himself. One of the foals, emboldened by curiosity, approached him with halting steps, its ears pricked forward in interest. "Well, hello there," James said softly, extending his hand slowly. The foal sniffed his fingers before darting back to its mother, who watched the exchange with what James could only describe as tolerance. As the day wore on, James found himself accepted into the strange society of the herd. They grazed around him, occasionally coming close enough to inspect this unusual visitor. The mare that had been his constant companion remained nearby, as if ensuring his safety among her kind. The valley offered natural protection from the worst of the elements, and James discovered a small spring where fresh water bubbled up from the ground. His military training kicked in as he assessed his situation. He had shelter, water, and through the horses access to areas where food might be found. He could survive here until his strength fully returned, or until he was found. That night, as he settled among the herd, their massive bodies creating an island of warmth in the frigid night air, James found himself thinking about his grandfather's stories. The old man had spoken of these horses with reverence, describing them as guardians of the land and all who respected it. As a child, James had loved those tales. As an adult, he had dismissed them as fantasy. Now, he wasn't so sure. What he did know was that without these remarkable animals, he would be dead, frozen to the cross where Hank had left him. The thought of the man who had nearly killed him stirred anger in James's heart, but it was a distant emotion overshadowed by gratitude for his unlikely saviors. As sleep began to claim him, surrounded by the gentle sounds of the herd, James realized something profound. For the first time since returning from war, the nightmares that had plagued him nightly seemed distant, held at bay by the simple presence of these magnificent creatures. In their company, the horrors of war faded, replaced by a peace he had thought forever beyond his reach. For 3 days, James lived among the horses, his strength returning with each passing hour. The herd accepted his presence with remarkable tolerance, allowing him to observe their social structures and behaviors. The mare who had rescued him, whom he had begun calling Luna for the crescent-shaped mark beneath her mane, remained his constant companion, while the stallion, now dubbed Atlas for his strength and leadership, watched over both of them with vigilant eyes. James established a routine that aligned with the herd's natural rhythms. He would wake at dawn as the horses began to stir, joining them as they moved through the valley in search of food. The horses had an uncanny ability to find patches where the snow was thin enough to paw through to the grass beneath. James watched and learned, discovering edible plants that had survived the winter cold and techniques for conserving his energy in the harsh environment. On the morning of the 4th day, James awoke feeling stronger than he had since before his ordeal began. The deep chill that had settled in his bones was finally receding, and the color had returned to his extremities. He stretched, testing muscles that had been pushed to their limits, and found that the pain had dulled to a manageable ache. "I need to get back," he told Luna as she grazed nearby. "Emma and Sarah need to know I'm alive." The mare raised her head, regarding him with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand far more than should be possible. After a moment, she approached and gently nudged his shoulder, a gesture he had come to recognize as affection. "I know," James said, rubbing her forehead. "I wouldn't have survived without you, but I can't stay here forever." As if in response, Luna turned and began walking toward the edge of the valley, stopping to look back at him expectantly. James hesitated, then followed. As they reached the perimeter of the herd's territory, Atlas joined them, his powerful presence commanding respect. "Are you coming with me?" James asked, hardly daring to believe these wild creatures might choose to accompany him back to civilization. The horses simply waited, their patience seemingly infinite. With a deep breath, James began the journey back toward Redemption Valley, his unlikely companions flanking him protectively. Meanwhile, the search for James had reached a critical point. Resources were stretched thin, and some of the volunteers had already returned to town, convinced that no one could survive so long in such brutal conditions. Sheriff Donovan had been forced to split his deputies between the search and their regular duties, and even Emma's unwavering determination had begun to show signs of strain. "We'll head out to the Eastern Ridge today," Donovan told the remaining search party members, his voice betraying his fatigue. "If we don't find any sign of him by nightfall, we'll need to—" He couldn't finish the sentence, not with Emma standing right there, clutching a thermos of coffee with white-knuckled hands. "We'll find him," Emma said firmly, though the shadows under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights and dwindling hope. Tom Blackfeather, who had remained with Emma's group despite the increasingly dangerous conditions, studied the map spread across the hood of Donovan's truck. His weathered finger traced a path that no one else had considered. "The horses sometimes use this pass in winter," he said quietly. "It's sheltered from the worst of the storms." Emma moved closer, hope flickering in her eyes. "You think James might have found it?" Tom shrugged, his expression unreadable. "The pass itself, perhaps not. But if the horses found him first—" "That's a mighty big if," Donovan interrupted, skepticism evident in his tone. "We're looking for a man, not fairy tales about magical horses." Tom's gaze hardened slightly. "There's nothing magical about respect, Sheriff. These horses have survived in this valley for generations because they understand things we've forgotten." Before Donovan could respond, another search party member called out, pointing to a distant ridge where 3 figures had appeared, silhouetted against the morning sky. "Are those horses?" someone asked, raising binoculars for a better look. Emma snatched the binoculars, her hands trembling as she focused on the distant forms. 2 massive white horses, and between them, a human figure. "James," she whispered, tears immediately springing to her eyes. "It's James." The search party erupted in activity, radios crackling as the news spread to other groups. Donovan shouted orders, organizing a team to reach the ridge as quickly as possible. Only Tom remained still, a knowing smile crossing his face as he watched the figures descend toward them. "The horses chose well," he murmured, too quietly for anyone to hear. As James made his way down the slope, supported on either side by Luna and Atlas, he felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief at the sight of the search party, joy at knowing he would soon be reunited with Emma and Sarah, and a strange sadness at the thought of leaving the horses who had saved him in more ways than one. "They're going to think I'm crazy," he told Luna, who flicked an ear in response. "A man rescued by wild horses? No one will believe it." Yet as they drew closer to the search party, James saw the awe on their faces. Even from a distance, the sheer size and majesty of Luna and Atlas were undeniable. These weren't ordinary horses. They were something extraordinary, something that demanded respect. The first person to reach them was Emma, who had broken away from the group and run ahead, ignoring Donovan's calls to wait. She stopped several yards away, her eyes wide as she took in the sight of her husband flanked by 2 enormous white horses. "James," she called, her voice breaking with emotion. "Emma," he replied, and the sound of her name on his lips felt like coming home. The horses halted, allowing James to take several steps forward on his own. He was stronger now, able to stand without support, though his body still bore the evidence of his ordeal. As he and Emma embraced, tears flowing freely between them, James felt the horses watching, silent guardians of the moment. "I thought I'd lost you," Emma sobbed against his chest. "I was lost," James admitted, holding her tightly. "But I was found too." When Emma finally pulled back enough to look into his face, she gasped softly. There was something different in his eyes. A peace she hadn't seen since before his deployment, a clarity that had been missing since his return. "What happened out there?" she asked, glancing nervously at the horses who remained watchful but calm. James smiled, following her gaze to Luna and Atlas. "A story you might not believe, but they saved me, Emma. Not just my life, but something more." As the rest of the search party cautiously approached, James turned to his equine rescuers. They stood proudly, neither afraid nor aggressive, simply observing with that uncanny intelligence that had first captivated him. "Thank you," he said softly, knowing the words were inadequate but needing to say them nonetheless. Atlas tossed his magnificent head, while Luna stepped forward to gently touch her muzzle to James's outstretched hand. a final connection before their paths would diverge. In that touch was a world of understanding, a bond formed in the crucible of survival and healing. The journey back to town was a slow procession that none who witnessed it would ever forget. James rode in Sheriff Donovan's truck with Emma beside him, wrapped in thermal blankets as warmth gradually returned to his body. Behind them followed the search party vehicles, and alongside, to everyone's amazement, trotted Luna and Atlas, refusing to abandon James even as they approached the outskirts of civilization. "They're following us," Donovan said, glancing in his rearview mirror with a mixture of disbelief and concern. "Wild horses don't follow people into town." "These aren't ordinary horses," James replied quietly, his eyes meeting Luna's through the rear window. There was understanding in that gaze, a connection that defied conventional explanation. At the town clinic, Dr. Martinez was waiting, alerted by radio to prepare for James's arrival. As James was helped inside, the horses halted at the edge of the parking lot, drawing a crowd of curious onlookers who kept a respectful distance from the massive animals. "I've never seen horses that size," Martinez remarked as he examined James's frostbitten extremities. "And certainly never seen wild ones come this close to town. They saved my life," James said, wincing as feeling returned painfully to his damaged tissues. "I'd be dead without them." The doctor worked methodically, his expression growing more troubled as he documented James's injuries. "These rope burns on your wrists and ankles, and these bruises. Someone did this to you, didn't they?" Emma's hand tightened around James's as the room fell silent. Sheriff Donovan stepped closer, his weathered face grave. "James, I need to know what happened out there," he said. "Who did this to you?" James closed his eyes briefly, the memory of being bound to the cross sending a shiver through him that had nothing to do with the cold. "Hank Reeves found me when I collapsed near that old ranch property out by Eagle Ridge. James swallowed hard. "He tied me to a beam and left me to die." Donovan's expression hardened. "Hank Reeves, you say? The old drunk who lost his ranch a few years back?" James nodded. "He knew who I was. Said something about the town hero getting what he deserved." "I'll find him," Donovan promised, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip. "He won't get away with attempted murder." But James shook his head. "It's not that simple, Sheriff. When Luna and Atlas found me, something changed. Not just for me, but for him too, I think." "What do you mean?" Emma asked, confusion evident in her voice. James struggled to put into words the transformation he had experienced. "I was so angry when I left home that night. Angry at myself, at the world, at everyone who called me a hero when I felt like a failure. That anger was killing me from the inside." He paused, looking at each face in the room. "But out there with those horses, something broke open. I can't explain it, but the rage is gone. Not forgotten, but transformed." Dr. Martinez exchanged glances with Donovan, clearly wondering if James was suffering from exposure-induced delirium. But Emma saw something in her husband's eyes that she recognized, a clarity that had been absent since his return from Afghanistan. "The horses," she said softly. "They did something to help you heal." "Not just my body," James confirmed. "When you're out there, stripped of everything, facing death, priorities become clear. The horses live in the moment, completely present. They showed me how to do that again." Outside, the crowd around Luna and Atlas had grown, but the horses remained calm, their attention fixed on the clinic door as if waiting. Tom Blackfeather had positioned himself between the horses and the more curious onlookers, silently ensuring they weren't disturbed. As Dr. Martinez finished his examination, he delivered his assessment. "You're suffering from moderate frostbite, dehydration, and exhaustion, but nothing that won't heal with time and proper care. Honestly, it's a miracle you survived at all. Not a miracle, James said, just two very special horses. After James was settled in a room for observation, Sheriff Donovan organized a team to track down Hank Reeves. Emma remained by her husband's side, their hands intertwined as if afraid to let go again. "I was so scared," she admitted, tears welling in her eyes. "When you didn't come home that night, I thought—" "I know," James said, squeezing her hand. "I'm sorry, Emma. I wasn't thinking clearly. The nightmares, the flashbacks, they were getting worse, and I couldn't bear to burden you with them anymore." "You were never a burden," she insisted. "I just didn't know how to reach you." James nodded, understanding flooding through him. "I didn't know how to be reached. It was like I was behind a wall of glass, seeing everything but unable to truly connect." "And now?" Emma asked hesitantly. James considered the question, testing his emotions like probing a wound to check if it still hurt. "Now, I feel present. Here. The memories haven't disappeared, but they don't own me anymore." He smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "I want to see Sarah. I want to be her father again." Emma's tears flowed freely now, but they were tears of relief and joy. "She's been asking for you every day. My mother's watching her, but she'll be so happy to see you." As they talked, a commotion outside drew their attention. Emma moved to the window and gasped, "James, you need to see this." With her help, he rose from the bed and joined her at the window. In the parking lot below, Luna and Atlas remained, but now they were surrounded by a respectful circle of townspeople. Children watched wide-eyed from behind their parents' legs, and several older residents had brought offerings of apples and carrots, which they placed on the ground before backing away. The horses accepted these gifts with gentle dignity, their behavior so unlike typical wild animals that murmurs of amazement rippled through the crowd. "They're waiting for you," Emma whispered, awe in her voice. James watched as Tom Blackfeather approached the horses, speaking words too quiet to hear. The old man showed no fear, and the horses accepted his presence as they had accepted James's. "They know who respects them," James said. "My grandfather always said these horses could see into a person's soul." Emma looked at him, a question in her eyes. What will happen to them now? It was a question James had been avoiding. These wild creatures didn't belong in town, yet they had chosen to follow him to ensure his safety. The bond between them transcended the normal boundaries between human and animal, yet James knew they couldn't stay. "They need to return to their herd," he said finally. "They belong to the wilderness." Yet even as he spoke the words, James felt a profound sense of loss at the thought of saying goodbye to the beings who had not only saved his life but helped him find his way back to himself. In the few days he had spent with them, Luna and Atlas had become more than rescuers. They had become teachers, companions, friends. "But not yet," he added softly. "Not just yet." By evening, word had spread throughout Redemption Valley about James's miraculous rescue and the extraordinary horses that had brought him home. The local news station sent a reporter who kept a respectful distance from Luna and Atlas as they continued their vigil outside the clinic. Social media buzzed with photos and videos of the massive white horses, their unusual behavior captivating viewers far beyond the small town's borders. Inside, James was reunited with his daughter Sarah, who burst into the room with the unrestrained enthusiasm of a 5-year-old. She launched herself onto the bed, Emma barely managing to intercept her before she could impact James's recovering body. "Daddy, you came back!" Sarah exclaimed, her small face alight with joy. "Of course I did, sweetheart," James replied, his voice thick with emotion as he gently pulled her into a careful embrace. "I promised I would always come back to you, remember?" Sarah nodded solemnly against his chest. Then she pulled back, her expression suddenly serious in that way only children can manage. Mommy said horses brought you home. Big white horses. James exchanged a glance with Emma, who gave a slight shrug. That's right, he confirmed. Can I see them? Sarah asked, bouncing slightly with excitement. James hesitated, looking to Dr. Martinez, who had returned to check his vital signs. The doctor considered for a moment, then nodded. A short visit to the window shouldn't hurt. Just don't overexert yourself. With Emma's help, James made his way back to the window with Sarah in his arms. The little girl gasped when she saw Luna and Atlas below, their white coats gleaming under the parking lot lights. They're so big, she whispered in awe, and so pretty. They're very special, James agreed. They found me when I was lost and helped me come home to you and Mommy. Sarah pressed her small hand against the glass as if trying to reach the horses. To the astonishment of everyone in the room, Luna raised her head at that exact moment, looking directly at the window where they stood. It was impossible that the horse could see them from that distance and angle, yet her gaze seemed to fix on Sarah with uncanny precision. She sees me, Sarah said with absolute certainty. She knows me. James felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with his recent exposure. There was something in his daughter's tone, a recognition, an understanding, that echoed his own experience with the horses. Before he could respond, Sheriff Donovan returned, his expression grim as he entered the room. He nodded respectfully to Emma and Sarah before addressing James. "We found Hank Reeves," he said quietly. "Holed up in that old barn where he left you." "Is he under arrest?" Emma asked, instinctively pulling Sarah closer to her side. Donovan sighed heavily. "He's dead, I'm afraid. Exposure, most likely. Doc will confirm once we get him back to town." James closed his eyes briefly, a complex mix of emotions washing over him. He had no shelter, no fire. "Nothing," Donovan confirmed. "Just an empty bottle of whiskey clutched in his hand. Looks like he went back there after leaving you and just gave up." A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by Sarah's innocent question. "Who's Hank Reeves, Daddy?" James exchanged glances with Emma, who subtly shook her head. "Someone who was very lost, sweetheart," he answered finally. "Even more lost than I was." Later, after Sarah had been taken home by Emma's mother for the night, James found himself alone with his thoughts. The irony wasn't lost on him. Hank had left him to die in the cold, only for the same fate to claim Hank himself. Yet where James had found salvation in the form of Luna and Atlas, Hank had faced his end alone, with only a bottle for company. "I forgive you," James whispered to the empty room, surprising himself with the sincerity of the words. The anger that had been his constant companion since returning from war seemed to have melted away during his time with the horses, replaced by a compassion he'd thought forever lost to him. A gentle knock at his door roused him from his contemplation. Tom Blackfeather entered, his weathered face solemn in the dim light. "The horses are still waiting," he said without preamble. "They won't leave until they know you're safe." James nodded. "I need to see them, to thank them properly." Tom's eyes glinted with understanding. "Dr. Martinez says you can leave tomorrow. If your condition remains stable, the horses will wait." "Well, how do you know so much about them?" James asked, curiosity finally overcoming him. Tom settled into the chair beside the bed, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "My people have lived in these mountains for countless generations. The white horses have always been there, watching over the land." He smiled slightly. "My grandfather was the keeper of their stories. He passed them to me, as I have passed them to my grandson. Are they special somehow? Different from other wild horses?" "All living things are special," Tom replied, "but these horses, they see differently. They recognize truth in a person's heart, the kind of truth we often hide even from ourselves." James thought about his time in the wilderness, about the moments when he had spoken his darkest thoughts aloud to Luna and Atlas. "They knew I needed to face my demons," he said slowly, "to speak the things I couldn't say to anyone else." Tom nodded. "They have always been healers of the spirit. In the old days, when one of our people carried a burden too heavy to bear, they would go to the sacred valley and sit with the horses, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. They always returned changed." "Like a vision quest," James suggested. "Something like that," Tom agreed. "Though the horses choose who they help. They chose you, James Mitchell. That is no small thing." The next morning, James awoke feeling stronger. Dr. Martinez examined him and, satisfied with his progress, agreed to discharge him with strict instructions for rest and follow-up care. "Those horses are still out there," Martinez said, shaking his head in wonder. "Haven't moved except to drink from the water some folks brought out for them. Never seen anything like it." Emma arrived with clean clothes and helped James dress. As they prepared to leave, she asked the question that had been on both their minds. "What happens now? With Luna and Atlas, I mean." James had been pondering this same question throughout the night. "They need to return to their herd," he said. "But I don't think they'll go until they know I'm truly safe." He paused, a plan forming in his mind. "I need to show them that I'm home, that I'm healing. And then I need to let them go." The knowledge brought a deep sadness, but also acceptance. These magnificent creatures had given him an invaluable gift. Now he needed to honor their wild nature by releasing them back to where they belonged. When James finally emerged from the clinic, leaning slightly on Emma for support, a hushed silence fell over the small crowd that had gathered. Luna and Atlas stood exactly where they had been since their arrival, patient sentinels whose presence had become the talk of the town. At the sight of James, both horses raised their heads, ears pricked forward in unmistakable recognition. "They've been waiting for you," Tom Blackfeather said, stepping forward from where he had maintained his own vigil near the horses. "Never seen anything like it in all my years." James moved slowly toward them, his body still weak, but his spirit stronger than it had been in years. As he approached, Luna stepped forward to meet him, lowering her massive head to gently touch his outstretched hand. The connection sent a wave of emotion through James so powerful that tears sprang unbidden to his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, leaning his forehead against her muzzle. "Both of you." Atlas maintained a slight distance, watchful and protective as ever, but his intelligent gaze never left James. There was communication in that look, an understanding that transcended words. "They can't stay in town," James said, turning to Emma, who stood nearby, watching the reunion with wonder in her eyes. "They need to go back to their herd eventually." "But you're still recovering," she protested. "You can't take them back into the wilderness now." James nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. "No, but they need space, freedom. Our backyard isn't big enough." Tom stepped forward, his weathered face thoughtful. "My land borders the national forest. There's a pasture that backs right up to the wilderness area. They could stay there for a while, close enough to visit, far enough from town to feel comfortable." The offer hung in the air, a perfect solution to the immediate problem. James looked to the horses, as if seeking their approval. Luna nickered softly, while Atlas pawed at the ground once, gestures that James had come to recognize during their time together. "They agree," he said with certainty, though he couldn't have explained how he knew. The journey to Tom's property created a strange procession that drew even more attention than the horse's presence at the clinic. James rode in Emma's truck, while Luna and Atlas trotted alongside, never straying far from the vehicle. People lined the streets to witness the remarkable sight, children pointing in excitement as the magnificent horses passed. Tom's land was everything he had promised, a sprawling property that ended where the wilderness began. A large pasture with a natural spring offered ideal temporary accommodations for the horses, with easy access to the forest beyond should they choose to leave. "It's perfect," James said as they stood at the fence line, watching Luna and Atlas explore their new surroundings. "Thank you, Tom." The old man nodded, his eyes following the horses' movements. "They won't stay forever," he warned. "Wild things belong to the wild, but they'll stay until you're ready to let them go." Emma slipped her hand into James's, her expression a mixture of wonder and concern. "How did you know? About them agreeing to come here, I mean." James considered her question carefully. "It's hard to explain. When I was out there with them, we developed a kind of understanding. They communicate, not with words, but with intent, with presence." He smiled, acknowledging how strange it must sound. "I know it doesn't make sense." "It makes perfect sense," Tom interjected quietly. "The old one said the great horses speak to the heart, not the ears." That evening, James returned home for the first time since his ordeal began. The familiar surroundings felt simultaneously comforting and strange, as if he were seeing everything through new eyes. Sarah was waiting, bouncing with excitement, full of questions about her horses, as she had already begun calling Luna and Atlas. "Can we visit them tomorrow, Daddy?" she asked, as James tucked her into bed, a ritual he had performed mechanically before his disappearance, but now approached with full presence and gratitude. "Yes, sweetheart, they'll be here for a while." "Will they stay forever?" Sarah's eyes were wide with hope. James stroked her hair gently. "No, honey. They have their own family, their own home in the mountains. They need to go back eventually." Sarah considered this with the seriousness only children can bring to important matters. "Like when you had to go away to the war but you came back?" The comparison caught James off guard, a lump forming in his throat. "Something like that," he managed. "They came when I needed them most, but now they need to return to where they belong." After Sarah fell asleep, James found Emma on the back porch, wrapped in a blanket against the evening chill. He joined her, their shoulders touching as they looked out at the distant mountains silhouetted against the night sky. "The nightmares didn't come last night," James said after a long, comfortable silence. "First time since before Afghanistan." Emma turned to look at him, hope and caution warring in her expression. "Really?" He nodded. "I've been carrying so much, Emma. Guilt, anger, fear. Out there with Luna and Atlas, something changed. They saw me, really saw me, and didn't judge, just accepted. The way we've always tried to," Emma said softly, a hint of hurt in her voice. James took her hand, squeezing gently. "I know, and I'm sorry I couldn't let you in, but I couldn't accept myself. So how could I believe anyone else would?" He paused, gathering thoughts that had been forming since his rescue. "Those horses gave me a gift, Emma. They showed me how to be present again, how to live in this moment instead of being trapped in the past." "They're remarkable animals," Emma agreed. "The way they waited for you, the way they seemed to understand." "Tom says they've always been like that, these specific horses in this valley. His people have stories about them going back generations. Guardians, healers." Emma leaned against him, her warmth a comfort in the cool evening air. "Whatever they are, I'm grateful they found you." In the days that followed, James divided his time between recovery at home and visits to Tom's land to see Luna and Atlas. The horses remained, showing no inclination to return to the wilderness just yet. They greeted James with obvious recognition each time he appeared, and to everyone's surprise, seemed equally taken with Sarah, who had overcome her initial shyness and now chattered away to them as if they understood every word. "They probably do understand in their way," Tom remarked as they watched Sarah feeding apples to Luna from her small palm, fearless despite the horse's enormous size compared to her tiny frame. "She has a connection with them," James agreed. "Different from mine, but just as real." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "Children see truth more clearly than adults. We learn to doubt, to question. They simply know." As winter gradually released its grip on Redemption Valley, the story of James and the horses spread far beyond the town's borders. News outlets from around the country sent reporters to document the remarkable tale of the veteran rescued by wild horses. Wildlife experts and equine specialists arrived to observe Luna and Atlas, marveling at their unusual size, intelligence, and behavior. "These horses exhibit characteristics rarely seen in wild populations," explained Dr. Elena Vasquez, a renowned equine behaviorist who had traveled from Colorado to study them. "Their social intelligence, their ability to read and respond to human emotions, it's extraordinary." James found himself uncomfortable with the attention both for himself and for the horses. He declined most interview requests, protective of the experience that had transformed him. But he couldn't shield Luna and Atlas from the curious eyes that came to Tom's property, hoping for a glimpse of the famous white horses. "They don't like the attention," James told Emma, as they watched a small group of tourists taking photos from the fence line. "Especially Atlas. He's been more on edge lately." "Can you blame them?" Emma replied. "Everyone wants a piece of their story. Your story." The horses had indeed begun showing signs of restlessness. Atlas in particular had taken to standing at the fence line that bordered the wilderness, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. Luna seemed more content, especially when Sarah visited, but even she had begun to display a certain wistfulness that James recognized all too well. "They miss their herd," James said one evening as he and Tom sat on the old man's porch, watching the horses graze in the fading light. "Their family." Tom nodded, his weathered hands cradling a mug of coffee. "The spring migration will start soon. The herd always moves to the high country when the snow melts." James felt a pang of sadness at the thought of Luna and Atlas leaving, yet he knew it was inevitable, and right. "I need to take them back," he said quietly, "before they leave on their own." "Are you strong enough for that journey?" Tom asked, his concern evident. James had been regaining his strength daily, the physical scars of his ordeal healing faster than anyone had expected. The psychological healing had been even more remarkable. His nightmares had all but disappeared, and the hypervigilance that had plagued him since Afghanistan had subsided to manageable levels. "I'm strong enough," James assured him. "And I need to do this, Tom, for them and for me too." That night, as James discussed his decision with Emma, he found her surprisingly supportive. "I knew this day would come," she said, curled against him on the couch after Sarah had gone to bed. "They never belonged here, not really." "They belonged with me for a time," James replied. "Just long enough to bring me back to myself, to you and Sarah." Emma traced the lines of his face with gentle fingers, noting the peace that had replaced the haunted look he'd carried for so long. "When will you go?" "Tomorrow," James decided. "I'll ask Tom to come with me. We'll take them back to the valley where I found them, where they found me." "I want to come too," said a small voice from the doorway. Sarah stood there in her pajamas, clutching her stuffed horse to her chest. She had obviously been listening to their conversation. James and Emma exchanged glances. "Honey, it's going to be a long, difficult hike," Emma began. "They're my friends too," Sarah insisted, her chin set in the stubborn angle that James recognized all too well. The same determination Emma showed when her mind was made up. James considered his daughter thoughtfully. There was wisdom in her eyes beyond her years, a connection to Luna and Atlas that rivaled his own. Perhaps she deserved to be part of this journey, this completion of the circle. It might be good for her to see this, he told Emma softly. To understand that sometimes letting go is an act of love. After much discussion, they agreed that Sarah could come for part of the journey. Tom knew a route where they could drive most of the way, then hike the final few miles to the valley. Emma would come too, making it a family pilgrimage of sorts. The next morning dawned clear and mild, a perfect spring day. James arrived at Tom's property early, his heart heavy with anticipation. Luna greeted him with her usual gentle nudge, while Atlas stood alert, seeming to sense that something significant was about to happen. "Today's the day," James told them, stroking Luna's neck. "Time to go home." Tom had already prepared everything, minimal supplies, just enough for safety during the day's journey. When Emma's truck pulled up with Sarah bouncing excitedly in the back seat, the horses perked up visibly. "Luna! Atlas!" Sarah called, rushing to the fence as soon as Emma helped her out of the car. The horses approached, lowering their massive heads to her level with remarkable gentleness. Loading everyone into Tom's old pickup truck was a logistical challenge. James, Emma, and Sarah squeezed into the cab with Tom, while the horses followed behind as they slowly drove toward the wilderness boundary. It was a strange procession. The truck creeping along the old Forest Service road, with two magnificent white horses trotting patiently behind. "They know where we're going," Sarah announced with absolute certainty after they had been driving for about an hour. James glanced back through the rear window. Luna and Atlas had picked up their pace, moving with a new energy, their heads held high. "I think you're right," he agreed. They reached the trailhead by mid-morning, where the road ended and the true wilderness began. As they unloaded from the truck, the horses grew visibly excited, moving with heightened awareness, sniffing the air and pawing at the ground. "We'll walk from here," Tom said, shouldering a small backpack. "It's about 3 miles to the valley where the herd usually gathers this time of year." The hike was challenging but beautiful. Spring had begun its transformation of the landscape. Patches of wildflowers brightened the forest floor, and new green growth softened the stark winter appearance of the trees. Sarah rode on James's shoulders for part of the journey, chattering happily to the horses who stayed close by, occasionally touching her dangling feet with their noses, making her giggle. For James, each step was meaningful, a journey not just through physical space, but through the landscape of his healing. He had entered these mountains broken and lost, haunted by ghosts of war and failure. He would leave them whole, reconnected to himself and his family. "Look!" Sarah suddenly pointed ahead as they crested a ridge. Below them stretched the valley where James had spent those transformative days with the herd. And there, scattered across the greening meadow, were dozens of horses, the extended family of Luna and Atlas. The valley spread before them like a painting come to life, a vast expanse of greening meadow dotted with the powerful forms of wild horses. From their vantage point on the ridge, James could see at least 30 animals grazing peacefully in the spring sunshine. The sight stirred memories of his time among them, when his broken spirit had begun to heal under their watchful eyes. "They're beautiful," Emma whispered, her hand finding James's as they stood transfixed by the scene below. Beside them, Luna and Atlas had grown completely still, their attention fixed on the herd in the distance. James could feel a tension in them, a longing so palpable it seemed to vibrate in the air between them. Yet they didn't rush forward, remaining instead at James's side as if awaiting permission or perhaps offering him one final moment of connection. "It's okay," James told them softly, reaching out to touch each of them in turn. "That's where you belong." Tom had moved a short distance away with Sarah, giving James this moment of privacy. The old man understood the significance of what was happening, not just horses returning to their herd, but the completion of a circle, the final act in James's journey back from the brink. As if responding to an unheard signal, Luna was the first to step forward. She pressed her muzzle against James's chest one last time, her breath warm against his heart. Then she turned toward Sarah, who had broken away from Tom to rush forward. "Are you leaving now?" Sarah asked, her small hands reaching up to touch Luna's face. The horse lowered her massive head, allowing the child's fingers to trace the distinctive mark beneath her mane. There was such tenderness in the gesture that Emma gasped softly, her eyes filling with tears at the sight of her daughter communing so naturally with this wild creature. "She has to go home, sweetheart," James explained, kneeling beside Sarah. "Just like we have to go back to our home." Sarah nodded solemnly, wisdom beyond her years shining in her eyes. "I know, Daddy, but I'll miss her." "We all will," James agreed. "But we'll remember them and what they taught us." Atlas, who had maintained a slight distance, now stepped forward. The stallion's presence commanded respect as always, his intelligent eyes seeming to evaluate each human one final time. When he reached James, he lowered his head in what almost appeared to be a bow, a gesture so unexpected that even Tom murmured in surprise. "I've never seen anything like that," the old man said quietly. "A wild stallion showing deference to a human." James reached up slowly, placing his palm against Atlas's forehead. "Not deference," he corrected. "Recognition. One survivor to another." The moment stretched, heavy with meaning, until Atlas finally stepped back. He turned toward the valley and with a soft whinny began to descend the slope. Luna hesitated only a moment longer, touching her muzzle to Sarah's outstretched hand one last time before following her companion. The family stood in silence, watching as the two white horses made their way down into the valley. About halfway down, Luna and Atlas broke into a trot, then a canter, their powerful bodies moving with fluid grace across the landscape. The sight was breathtaking. Two magnificent creatures returning to freedom, their white coats gleaming in the sunlight. When Luna and Atlas were about 100 yards from the herd, the other horses noticed them. The reaction was immediate, heads raised, ears pricked forward, a ripple of movement spreading through the gathered animals. Then, as James and his family watched in awe, several horses broke away from the main group, galloping toward Luna and Atlas with obvious excitement. "It's their family," Tom explained, his voice hushed with respect. "Look there, that young stallion with the dark legs. He's probably Atlas's offspring." The reunion was unlike anything James had ever witnessed. The horses circled each other, touching noses, nickering softly, moving in what almost seemed like a choreographed dance of recognition and welcome. Luna was surrounded by several younger horses who pressed close to her sides, while Atlas engaged in a display of prancing energy with the young stallion Tom had pointed out. "They remember each other," Sarah said with absolute certainty. "They missed Luna and Atlas." "Yes," James agreed, his throat tight with emotion. "They did." As they watched, the reunited horses gradually made their way back to the main herd, where more greetings were exchanged. Soon, Luna and Atlas were reabsorbed into the group, distinguishable only by their pure white coats among the various shades of their companions. Emma slipped her arm around James's waist. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. James considered the question carefully. The ache of separation was there, a bittersweet pain in his chest. Yet beneath it was something else, a sense of rightness, of completion. "I am," he said, surprising himself with the truth of it. "This is how it should be." "Will we ever see them again?" Sarah asked, her small face solemn as she watched the herd. Tom, who had been quiet throughout the reunion, now spoke up. "The herd follows patterns, little one. They'll be in the high country for summer, but when fall comes, they'll return to this valley. If you come back then, you might see them." Sarah brightened at this promise, but James knew better than to expect another personal encounter like the one he'd experienced. Luna and Atlas had intervened in his life at a critical moment for reasons he would never fully understand. That gift was not likely to be repeated, nor did it need to be. Whether we see them again or not, he told Sarah, lifting her onto his shoulders for a better view, they'll always be part of our story. They remained on the ridge for nearly an hour, watching as the herd gradually moved across the valley floor, grazing and interacting in the complex social patterns of wild horses. Occasionally, James thought he could pick out Luna or Atlas among them, but increasingly they became indistinguishable, just two members of a greater whole, exactly as nature intended. Finally, Tom suggested they begin their return journey before the afternoon grew too late. As they prepared to leave, James took one last look at the valley where his life had been transformed. The herd had moved to the far side now, appearing as distant figures against the backdrop of mountains. "Thank you," he whispered, his words carried away by the gentle spring breeze. As they hiked back toward the trailhead, James found himself walking with a new lightness. Emma noticed it too, reaching for his hand with a smile of recognition. Sarah skipped ahead with Tom, peppering the patient old man with endless questions about horses and the wilderness and the stories his grandfather had told him. James listened to their conversation with half an ear, his thoughts still with Luna and Atlas. He had gone into the wilderness broken and alone, haunted by the ghosts of war. He was returning whole, reconnected to his family and himself. The white horses had led him out of his personal darkness, showing him a path back to life that he had been unable to find on his own. Summer settled over Redemption Valley, bringing with it long, warm days and star-filled nights. In the months following his return from the wilderness, James's life had transformed in ways that still surprised him. The physical scars of his ordeal had healed completely, leaving only faint marks on his wrists and ankles where the ropes had cut into his flesh. The psychological healing, however, was the true miracle. The nightmares that had plagued him since Afghanistan had all but vanished, replaced by restful sleep and occasionally dreams of white horses running free across mountain meadows. James had returned to work, not at his former accounting job, which had felt like a prison, but as a part-time guide with the local wilderness conservation group. Several days a week, he led small groups into the foothills, teaching them about the delicate ecosystem and the creatures that called it home, including, of course, the famous wild horses of Redemption Valley. "The horses have lived in these mountains for generations," he would explain to visitors, careful never to reveal the exact location of the herd. "They're not just animals. They're guardians of this land, as much a part of it as the trees and the rivers." On this particular evening, James sat on the back porch of his home, watching as Sarah played in the yard. Emma joined him, 2 glasses of iced tea in her hands, and settled into the chair beside him. "Tom called," she said, passing him a glass. "He says the herd has moved to the high country for summer, just like they always do." James nodded, taking a sip of his tea. "I figured they would by now. The valley gets too hot this time of year." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their daughter chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. Sarah had changed too in the months since their adventure. She carried herself with a quiet confidence that seemed beyond her years, and her connection to animals had blossomed into what Emma jokingly called a Dr. Dolittle complex. "The school called today," Emma said after a while. Mrs. Henderson was concerned about Sarah's essay. James raised an eyebrow. "What essay?" "The one where she wrote about her friends, the giant horses who saved her daddy." Emma's tone was light, but her expression held a question. Mrs. Henderson thought it was an unusually detailed fantasy. James smiled, watching as Sarah twirled in circles, arms outstretched like wings. "What did you tell her?" "That sometimes truth is stranger than fiction." Emma leaned her head against his shoulder. "I also said that Sarah processes things in her own way, and that's okay." The story of James and the horses had gradually faded from the headlines, though occasionally a reporter still called or a documentary filmmaker requested an interview. James declined most of these, protective of the experience that had reshaped his life. But he had agreed to one thing, working with Tom Blackfeather and several wildlife biologists to establish a protected corridor for the horses, ensuring their territory would remain undisturbed for generations to come. The fundraiser for the horse sanctuary exceeded our target, James mentioned, remembering the check he'd received that morning. We'll have enough to buy that additional land parcel that connects to the national forest. That's wonderful, Emma replied. Tom must be thrilled. He pretends not to be, James chuckled, but I can tell he is. Says his grandfather would be proud to see the old ways being honored. As darkness settled over their backyard, Sarah finally came bounding onto the porch, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "Daddy, I saw a white horse in the field behind Mr. Peterson's house," she announced, her eyes wide. James exchanged a glance with Emma. "A white horse? Are you sure, sweetheart?" Sarah nodded vigorously. It was looking right at me, and then it ran away into the trees. James lifted her onto his lap, smoothing back her wind-blown hair. "That's pretty far from the mountains, Sarah. Are you sure it wasn't Mr. Peterson's Palomino?" "I know what I saw," she insisted with the unwavering conviction of childhood. "It was one of our horses." Later, after Sarah was tucked into bed with promises of a weekend hike to look for wildflowers, James and Emma walked hand in hand under the stars. Their relationship had deepened in ways neither could have anticipated, the barriers between them dissolved by James's journey and return. "Do you think it's possible?" Emma asked as they paused to look up at the brilliant canopy of stars, "that one of the horses could have come this far from their territory?" James considered the question seriously. "Logically, no. It's miles of rough country, with roads and fences in between." He squeezed her hand. "But then again, nothing about Luna and Atlas ever followed the rules of what should be possible." Emma leaned against him, her warmth a comfort in the cool night air. "I sometimes wonder if we'll ever truly understand what happened out there, why those horses chose to save you, why they formed such a bond with you and Sarah." "I've stopped trying to explain it," James admitted. "Some things just are. Those horses knew exactly what I needed when I didn't know myself." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Tom says there are things in this world that science hasn't caught up to yet. Connections and understandings that his people have recognized for generations. Do you believe that now?" Emma asked, curious rather than skeptical. "I believe that when I was at my lowest, when I had lost myself completely, something extraordinary happened." James looked toward the distant mountains, silver-tipped in the moonlight. "Whether you call it a miracle, fate, or just the incredible intelligence of wild animals, it changed everything." The months passed, seasons changing as they always did. Fall painted the valley in reds and golds, and as Tom had predicted, the herd returned to the lower elevations. James took his family back to the ridge overlooking the valley where they had said goodbye to Luna and Atlas. They spotted the herd from a distance, peaceful figures grazing in the autumn light. "Can you see them, Daddy?" Sarah asked, perched on his shoulders for a better view. James scanned the herd, looking for the distinctive white coats among the browns and grays. For a moment he thought he glimpsed them, two white figures at the edge of the group looking in their direction, but it might have been a trick of the light, a wish made visible. "Maybe," he answered honestly, "but it doesn't matter if we see them or not. They're out there, living as they should, wild and free." As they made their way back down the trail, James reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had gone into the wilderness a broken man, haunted by war and bound by invisible chains of guilt and trauma. He had returned whole, not because all his wounds had healed, but because he had learned to carry them differently. And sometimes, On quiet nights when the mountains called to him, James would stand at his window and look toward the wilderness. There, in that space between sleeping and waking, he could almost see them. Two magnificent white horses running free under the stars, guardians of the wild places, healers of broken spirits, forever part of his story.